Why is he even still alive? I heard it as clear as the music blasting through the speakers the moment I stepped into my son's backyard. The words, sharp and careless, sliced through the evening air and straight into my chest. I stood there frozen, gripping the warm apple pie I had baked, the same recipe Linda used to make every Thanksgiving before she passed. There was laughter that followed light, casual, almost cruel in its indifference. Around me, the backyard glowed with string lights. Long picnic tables overflowed with food and drinks, glasses clinking together like a chorus. Yet not a single person noticed me, not a single head turned. And then Emily spotted me. Her smile stretched wide, too polished, too practiced. "Oh, Dad Robert, we didn't expect you to come," she said, tilting her head with feigned surprise. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. I walked in slowly, each step heavier than the last, and placed the pie on the far corner of the table, untouched and unnoticed. I sat down at the end, holding my head high, even as my heart sank lower. I didn't walk away that day, but what I did afterward changed everything. I remember sitting there at the far end of the long wooden table, feeling like a guest at someone else's celebration, even though it was my own son's house and my own flesh and blood gathered around. The string lights swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting golden shadows across faces that seemed more interested in their wine glasses than in acknowledging me. I traced the rim of my cup with a finger, watching the condensation slide down like a tear, and I could not help but wonder when exactly I had become invisible in a place where my very sacrifices had built the foundation beneath their feet. Michael moved about with a loud voice, greeting friends, making jokes that drew laughter from everyone except me. His tall frame, once awkward and lanky as a boy, now carried the confidence of a man who had grown used to being the center of attention, yet not once did his eyes meet mine. I kept waiting for him to look over, to nod, to even lift his chin in some subtle recognition that I was there, but he didn't. Instead, Emily floated beside him, glass of champagne in hand, whispering into his ear like a director feeding lines to an actor. Their synchronized smiles told me they were united in whatever play they were staging tonight. The music was too loud for a family gathering, the kind of playlist you'd expect at a college party, not at a home where a grandfather sat in silence. The bass thumped through my ribs, every beat echoing the memory of my late wife Linda's laugh. She used to tell me that houses hold on to echoes, that if you stood still long enough, you could hear the walls repeat the voices of those who once filled them. I tried to find her echo that night, tried to let her voice drown out the careless remark I had heard earlier, but all I caught was the clang of forks against porcelain and the hollow laughter of people too, wrapped up in their own bubbles. Then Emily, with that smile that never reached her eyes, stood at the center. She tapped her glass with a fork, silencing the chatter. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, the way you'd expect an anchor to announce the evening news. "We've decided," she said, glancing at Michael with staged affection, "to sell this house and move to something bigger, more modern, a place that truly reflects our future." The crowd erupted into cheers, hands clapping, glasses lifted. My ears rang with their enthusiasm, but my heart sank like a stone thrown into a deep well. This wasn't just a house. This was the place where Linda's laughter had once spilled from the kitchen, where Michael had taken his first steps, where I had patched walls with my bare hands after storms tore them open. I had poured not only money but sweat, time and fragments of my soul into this structure, and yet they spoke of selling it as though it were nothing more than an outdated appliance. I clenched my hands under the table, nails pressing into my palms, willing myself not to react too quickly. My voice, when it finally emerged, was low but steady. "When were you planning to tell your father?" I asked. Michael stuttered, scratching the back of his neck. "We thought tonight was the right time." The right time, as if springing it on me like a party trick was an act of kindness. I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than any knife. I looked around the table, scanning the faces, hoping someone would share my sense of disbelief. But all I saw were smiles, nods, and more toasts raised in celebration of a future that apparently did not include me. I caught Lily's eyes then. My granddaughter, with her long dark hair falling across her shoulders, looked down at her plate, her fork unmoving. Her cheeks flushed with discomfort, and for a fleeting second our eyes met. There was guilt in hers, a silent apology she could not voice in front of the others. That look, brief as it was, kept me from collapsing into despair. Emily's announcement continued. Details about the new neighborhood they had in mind, the schools, the bigger backyard, the modern amenities. Words like better lifestyle and investment opportunity poured from her lips like polished stones. Each phrase felt like an eraser stroke, slowly removing the years Linda and I had imprinted onto the walls of that house. I wanted to shout, to remind them that behind every beam and every nail was a memory, that this was more than real estate, it was legacy. But the lump in my throat silenced me. As the evening stretched on, my pie sat untouched at the end of the table. The frosting glistened under the light, the crust perfectly golden, the apples tender with cinnamon, but no one reached for it. Instead, Emily made a passing comment, her tone light but sharp. Cupcakes are easier, less messy. A few people chuckled, and then the pie was forgotten altogether. That pie wasn't just dessert, it was Linda's recipe, the taste of our family's autumns, the warmth of our kitchen, when the air outside grew cold. Watching it sit there, dismissed and disregarded, felt like watching Linda herself being pushed aside. Later, when Michael gathered everyone for a group photo, he handed me the camera. "Dad, can you take this one?" he asked, smiling like he was offering me a favor. I wanted to be in that picture, to stand beside him, to hold Lily's hand and remind myself that I still belonged. But instead, I lifted the camera, my hands trembling slightly, and pressed the shutter. I captured them all smiling, a perfectly framed family portrait where I was absent, erased, forgotten. The night wound down, laughter fading, guests trickling out. I stood quietly near the fence, watching Michael wave goodbye to his friends, Emily clearing glasses from the table. Lily approached me cautiously, her steps hesitant as though she was sneaking across forbidden ground. She touched my hand softly and whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." Her words, though simple, carried the weight of everything left unsaid. I squeezed her hand gently, forcing a smile. "Don't be sorry, Lily. Just remember this place. Remember what it held." She nodded, tears brimming but never falling, then turned back before Emily could notice. I walked home that night with empty hands. The pie dish, still full, had been left behind, forgotten like its maker. My apartment greeted me with silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own thoughts too loudly. I sat in my chair, staring at the walls, at the pictures of Linda that still hung there, and I thought about the conversation I had overheard at the very beginning of the evening. "Why is he even still alive?" The words gnawed at me. They weren't just careless. They were intentional, dismissive, an indictment that I was nothing more than an inconvenience. But as the clock ticked past midnight and the city outside hummed with distant traffic, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet resolve. I realized that what hurt me most wasn't the house or the pie or the photo I wasn't part of. It was the attempt to erase me while I was still breathing, to turn me into a ghost before death had even claimed me. And that, I decided, I could not allow. That night, I pulled out the old box from under my bed. Inside were papers, documents, fragments of a life carefully managed. My will, property deeds, savings account details, all pieces of my existence reduced to ink on paper. I stared at them long into the night, thinking of Michael, of Emily, of how easily they could reshape my life without even asking. And then I remembered the power of attorney I had signed years ago during knee surgery, trusting Michael to act in my best interest. That trust now felt like a chain around my neck. I wrote 4 words on a yellow notepad: keys, accounts, house, silence. It was not just a list, it was a vow. I would not fight with anger or fists. I would fight with steady hands and the quiet strength of a man who had already given too much. And as dawn began to creep through the blinds, I whispered to myself, "This time, they won't erase me. The morning after that gathering, I woke up to the faint hum of the city outside my window, the kind of hum that reminded me I was just one old man, in a world that kept spinning faster every day. The sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin stripes, painting the walls in alternating shadows and gold. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the notepad where I had written those 4 words the night before. Keys, accounts, house, silence. They looked almost too simple, like a child's list, yet I knew they carried the weight of the battle ahead. I brewed myself a cup of black coffee, strong and bitter, the way Linda used to make it on mornings when she knew I had a long day ahead at the workshop. I let the steam rise into my face, breathing it in like courage. My reflection in the kitchen window startled me for a second. Silver hair, messy, lines carved deep across my forehead, eyes tired but not defeated. I told myself aloud, "You're still here, Robert, and you matter." It felt strange to speak to my own reflection, but in that moment I needed to hear it. I spent the next hours sorting through files, sifting through decades of receipts, insurance policies, and documents that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Each sheet was a reminder of a life lived with discipline, of sacrifices made not for myself but for my family. I had always believed that preparing these things ahead of time was a way of protecting them. But now I realized I had also left myself unprotected, stripped of authority by my own misplaced trust. By noon, I called Evelyn Hart, an old friend from my working years. She had been a sharp attorney, relentless in court, and though we had not spoken in a long time, I remembered her as someone who never let anyone push her around. When her warm but firm voice answered, I felt a sliver of relief. "Robert Miller," she said, "it's been years. What's on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment, then exhaled. "Evelyn, I need to take back what I gave away. I need to revoke Michael's power over my finances." Then there was silence on the other end, then a sigh that carried both empathy and urgency. "Come by my office tomorrow. Bring everything. Don't wait on this." The next day I carried a folder under my arm like it was a shield. Evelyn's office had changed over the years, the paint fresher, the chairs more modern, but her presence remained the same, commanding, sharp, impossible to ignore. She read through my documents carefully, her glasses perched low on her nose. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Robert, you've been too generous, but it's not too late to take control." She helped me file the necessary papers, her pen moving swiftly, her words cutting through the legal jargon that would have drowned me on my own. Each signature I placed on those documents felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had surrendered too easily. By the time I walked out of her office, I felt taller, lighter, as though some invisible weight had been pried off my shoulders. But as empowered as I felt, I knew the hardest part still lay ahead facing Michael. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone. My thumb hovered over his number more times than I could count. I wanted to call him, to tell him straight that I was no longer under his control, but I also feared the storm it would unleash. It wasn't just about documents, it was about a son who had stopped seeing his father as a man and started seeing him as an obstacle. When I finally pressed the call button, my voice was calm. "Michael, we need to talk," I said. There was hesitation on the other end, then a weary reply. "Dad, is this about the house again?" "No," I said firmly. "This is about me. I've made changes. You no longer have power of attorney. I've revised my will. I'm making sure my choices are respected." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Then came his voice, sharp and incredulous. "Are you serious? Do you even know what you're doing?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," I answered. "You may sell that house if you must, but you will never sell me." For the first time in a long time, I felt my spine straighten as I spoke. There was no quiver in my voice, no hint of doubt, only truth. On the other end, Michael's anger turned into stunned silence. He hung up without another word. That night, I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding not from fear but from liberation. I thought about all the years I had spent bending myself into shapes to support him, to make sure he had what he needed, to cushion every fall. I thought about the nights Linda and I had stayed awake worrying about bills, only to still hand him money when he asked. And I realized that parenthood had made me strong, but it had also made me blind. I had given so much that I had forgotten I had a right to keep something for myself. Over the next weeks, I poured my time into something I had not allowed myself in years living for me. I started volunteering at the local shelter, helping other elderly men and women who had been left behind by their families. Their stories mirrored mine in haunting ways. Children who had abandoned them, savings drained by betrayal, dignity stripped away by those they once nurtured. Each time I helped someone fill out a form or listened to them recount memories of better days, I felt less alone. It was as if my own wounds were slowly being stitched by their shared experiences. Lily began visiting me more often. At first, it was under the guise of bringing me something Emily had forgotten, to send an extra dish from dinner, a stack of laundry, but I knew better. She needed to see me, to know I was still standing. We would sit together, sipping tea, and she would ask me about Linda, about the house when it was full of joy instead of tension. I told her stories of her father as a boy, how he used to run barefoot through the yard, his laughter echoing across the street. She listened with wide eyes, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning, as if she were piecing together a truth no one else would tell her. One evening, she said softly, "Grandpa, I don't want them to move. I don't want them to forget this house." I placed my hand on hers, the same way I once did with her father when he was scared of thunderstorms. Memories aren't locked inside walls, Lily, they're in us. But if you carry them, then nothing is ever lost. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time, I saw not just a granddaughter, but a young woman who understood the weight of legacy. And so, even as Michael and Emily moved forward with their plans, even as they showed the house to strangers and signed papers, I no longer had the power to stop. I found myself less burdened, because while they tried to erase me from the picture, I had carved a new place for myself, one where I was not a relic, but a man reclaiming his worth. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, I knew I was not fighting to be included at their table. I was fighting to stand tall at my own. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of calm and turbulence. Outwardly, my days settled into a rhythm: morning coffee, volunteer work at the shelter, occasional visits from Lily, but beneath that surface, a storm brewed inside me. It was not just about Michael and Emily anymore. It was about me confronting a truth I had avoided for too long. I had allowed myself to become a man who existed only in the margins of other people's lives. I found myself walking past the old house one evening. The street was quiet, the air heavy, with the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke from neighbors' yards. The windows of the house glowed softly, and for a moment I imagined Linda standing at the kitchen sink, humming an old tune, the way she used to when she thought no one was listening. But then a realtor's sign caught my eye, planted firmly in the front yard like a flag claiming territory. "For sale." The words were bold, unapologetic, and final. I stood there longer than I should have, my hands stuffed into my pockets, my chest aching. Memories crowded in Michael's first bike ride down the driveway, the summer nights when we strung up makeshift lights and hosted neighbors, the winters when Linda insisted on baking cookies for everyone on the block. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter, but they were faint, muffled by the reality that the house no longer belonged to the family it was built for. I wasn't sure if Michael saw me that night. He stepped out onto the porch, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing as if sealing some deal. His face was illuminated by the glow of the screen, hard and focused. Nothing like the boy who once begged me to read him bedtime stories. He didn't look up, didn't notice me in the shadows. Or maybe he did and chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement louder than I wanted them to be. The next day at the shelter, I sat across from a man named Henry, who had been abandoned by his children after they sold his house and left him with nothing. He told me his story in a voice cracked with bitterness, his hands shaking as he clutched the paper cup of coffee I had given him. "They said it was for my own good," he muttered, "that I couldn't keep up with the house anymore. Next thing I knew, they'd emptied my accounts. I was out on the street with a suitcase and nowhere to go." His pain was raw, his dignity shredded, and yet there was something familiar in his eyes. I realized with a jolt that I'd been dangerously close to his fate, that I might have been one signature away from losing everything. That realization didn't frighten me, it ignited me. I refused to let my story end like his. That night, I pulled out the documents Evelyn had helped me update and stared at them again. My will, now leaving part of my savings to Lily and part to the shelter. My accounts, secured with my own authority. My house, well, not my house, but the principle of what it represented, no longer a weapon that could be used against me. These papers were more than legalities. They were declarations. They were proof that even in the later chapters of life, I still had the power to write my own story. Michael eventually called me, his voice tight with anger. "Dad, why are you doing this? Do you think I'd really let you end up with nothing?" I answered calmly, though my heart pounded. "You didn't even think I deserved to know about the house until you made your announcement. You didn't think I deserved a seat in the family photo. Forgive me if I no longer trust your version of what's best for me." His words tumbled out quickly, defensive and sharp. "It's not like that. Emily and I just want a better future. Don't twist it." "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "I'm straightening it. I'm making sure I'm not erased before my time." He hung up without another word, and I sat there in the silence of my apartment, realizing that the distance between us was not measured in miles, but in choices. Lily, however, continued to be my anchor. She visited often, sometimes with a book in her hand, sometimes with nothing more than the need to talk. She told me how Emily rolled her eyes whenever my name came up, how Michael avoided bringing me into conversations about the future. It hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve. If they wanted to write me out of their story, then I would create one where I was not only present but necessary. One Saturday afternoon, Lily and I walked through the park near my apartment. The trees were just beginning to shed their leaves, the ground a patchwork of orange and gold. She kicked at the leaves with her sneakers, her face thoughtful. "Grandpa," she said, "do you ever regret how much you gave up for Dad?" The question pierced me deeper than I expected. I took a long breath before answering. "No, Lily, I don't regret it. Love is not measured by what you get back. It's measured by what you give. But I do regret not holding on to enough of myself. Because if you give everything away, you risk disappearing." She nodded slowly, as though storing those words somewhere safe inside her. And in that moment, I realized that even if Michael never understood, even if Emily never respected me, my voice still mattered, because it lived on in her. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of crimson, I felt something shift within me. I was no longer just fighting against being forgotten. I was fighting for the right to define myself, to leave behind not just a legacy of sacrifice, but of strength. And for the first time in years, I felt ready for whatever confrontation might come next. The confrontation I had been bracing myself for arrived sooner than I expected. One evening, Michael showed up at my apartment unannounced. The knock on the door was sharp, impatient, like he was demanding entry rather than requesting it. When I opened the door, he stood there with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and Emily just behind him, her expression the perfect blend of polite disdain and quiet triumph. For a moment, I simply stared at them, remembering all the times I had welcomed them with open arms, meals on the table, warmth in the air. This time my arm stayed firmly at my sides. Michael wasted no time. "Dad, what are you trying to prove? Do you think cutting me out of your papers is going to fix anything? You're just making this harder for everyone." His words hit me like cold rain, but I steadied myself. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Michael. I'm reclaiming what should never have been yours to control in the first place." Emily stepped forward, her voice smooth but laced with contempt. "Robert, you're letting pride cloud your judgment. Michael has always taken care of things for you. Why change that now?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw the calculation in her eyes, the way she measured me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle in her path. "Because," I said slowly, each word deliberate, "being alive means I still have a say, and I won't let my life be signed away under the pretense of care." The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Michael shifted, his face reddening. "You don't understand, Dad. This house, this move, it's about building something better. Why can't you just support us?" I felt a surge of something I hadn't allowed myself in years, anger sharpened with clarity. "Support you, Michael? I built the foundation you're standing on. I helped you buy that house. I patched its walls. I kept the lights on when you were struggling. Do not stand in my doorway and tell me I don't support you. What you're asking for now isn't support. It's submission, and I won't give it." End of war. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fists clenched at his sides. For a fleeting second, I thought he might lash out, but then his shoulders sagged and he turned away, muttering under his breath. Emily tugged at his arm, whispering something I couldn't catch, and they left without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed like a gavel striking wood, final and heavy. I sank into my chair afterward, my body trembling not from fear but from release. For the first time, I had stood my ground without wavering. The weight of years of silence and compliance had lifted, replaced by a steady determination that I would not be erased. The following days were quieter. Michael didn't call. Emily didn't send her polite but cutting messages. The distance between us stretched wider, and though it hurt, it also gave me space to breathe. I filled my days at the shelter, where my presence was not only acknowledged but valued. I fixed a broken shelf, painted a peeling wall, and helped a woman named Clara sort through her paperwork so she could finally access the benefits she had been denied. Each small act reminded me that usefulness didn't vanish with age, that dignity wasn't something to be handed out by others, it was something you claimed for yourself. Lily continued to visit more openly now. One afternoon, she came carrying a notebook, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Grandpa," she said, "I've been writing down your stories, the ones about Dad when he was little, about Grandma, about the house. I don't want them to disappear." Her words caught me off guard. My throat tightened, but I managed to smile. "Why are you doing this, Lily?" "Because," she said softly, "someday I want to remember everything. And I want my kids to know too, even if Dad and Mom don't talk about it." I reached out and pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of her sincerity. In her arms, I found proof that my existence mattered, that my voice carried forward in ways Michael and Emily could never silence. One evening, as I walked home from the shelter, I passed by the house again. The for sale sign now bore a bright red sticker, "Under contract." My chest tightened, but I didn't crumble. Instead, I stood tall on the sidewalk, whispering to myself, "They can sell the walls, but they can't sell the life that was lived here." A few days later, Michael called. His tone was colder, more resigned. "Dad, the house is gone. The deal is done. I thought you should hear it from me." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. "That's all you're going to say?" he asked, almost angrily. "What else is there?" I replied. "You made your choice. I've made mine. We move forward." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I don't know who you are anymore, Dad." His words stung, but I answered calmly, "I'm the same man who raised you, Michael. The difference is, I finally remembered who I was before I gave it all away." The line went dead, and with it, whatever illusion I had clung to, that reconciliation would come easily. Still, I felt no despair, only a quiet strength, because while I had lost a house, I had regained myself. That night, Lily sat beside me on the couch, notebook open on her lap. She looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, one day, I'm going to tell my kids about how strong you were, about how you didn't let anyone erase you." I felt tears prick my eyes, but I didn't hide them. I let them fall, not from sadness but from gratitude, because in her voice I heard the echo of everything I had fought for. And so, even as the world I once built shifted and changed, I knew I was not fading. I was still here, and my story was still mine to tell. The weeks after the sale of the house unfolded like a season of long shadows and slow reckonings. Though the walls that had sheltered so much of my life were no longer mine to touch, I felt strangely unburdened. as if the loss had burned away the last illusions I had been clinging to. My apartment, once a place I saw as small and lonely, began to feel like something else, entirely a blank canvas. Each morning, when I woke to the quiet hum of the city and the soft light slanting across the blinds, I realized I was not waking into emptiness. I was waking into possibility. I started moving furniture around, polishing old wood until it gleamed, hanging photographs in new places as if to remind myself that life could be rearranged without being erased. Linda's picture, which used to sit in the corner gathering dust, now hung in the center of the wall above my chair. She smiled down at me each evening as if to say, "You're finding your way." I found myself speaking to her more often, not in whispers of grief, but in steady tones of partnership, as though she was still the compass I needed to follow. At the shelter, my role expanded. The director noticed how easily people confided in me, how naturally I slipped into listening and helping. Soon, I wasn't just fixing shelves or painting walls. I was mentoring, guiding, offering words to men who had been silenced by shame. Some had lost everything to addiction, others to careless children or cruel luck, but all of them carried the same hollow ache I had felt standing in my son's backyard. I sat with them in the evenings, swapping stories of youth, of mistakes, of hard-earned wisdom. One man, Samuel, looked at me one night and said, "You talk like someone who knows what it's like to be erased." I nodded, because there was nothing else to say. And in that silence we understood each other. Lily's visits became the brightest part of my days. She came after school, sometimes with homework spread across my table, sometimes with nothing but her chatter about friends, teachers, and the small dramas of teenage life. I listened carefully, offering advice only when she asked for it. Mostly, I gave her the one thing I knew she would never get from Emily, and rarely from Michael: space to be fully herself, without judgment. One evening, she asked me, "Grandpa, were you scared when you told Dad about the will and everything?" I leaned back, considering. "Yes, Lily, I was scared. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I knew it would change how your father looked at me. But fear doesn't mean we stop. Sometimes fear is just proof that what we're doing matters." Quote. Her eyes widened a little, and she scribbled the words into her notebook, the same notebook where she had been gathering all my stories. I realized she was building something larger than I had imagined, a chronicle not just of my life, but of the values that threaded through it. In that moment, I understood that legacy was not measured in houses or bank accounts. It was measured in what the next generation chose to carry forward. Still, the wound with Michael lingered. He avoided me, and when we did cross paths, his tone was clipped, his eyes wary. I wondered sometimes if he hated me for standing up, or if deep down he was wrestling with guilt he couldn't admit. Emily, I suspected, preferred the wedge between us because distance gave her more room to shape him. I tried not to dwell on it, reminding myself that reconciliation could not be forced. Yet a part of me still longed for my son, for the boy who once clung to my hand in crowded streets, who once looked up at me as though I held the whole world. One afternoon, while walking home from the shelter, I passed a park where children played baseball. The crack of the bat against the ball echoed across the field, and in an instant I was transported back to a summer long ago when Michael was no older than Lily. He had begged me to teach him how to swing, and we had spent hours in the yard, my hands steadying his small ones around the bat. Every strike, every miss, every laugh came rushing back, vivid and alive. I stopped in my tracks, tears welling uninvited. That boy still lived somewhere inside the man he had become, and maybe, just maybe, if I held my ground, he would find his way back to remembering it too. I began writing letters, not the kind meant to be sent immediately, but the kind meant to live as a record, a testimony of thoughts too layered to speak aloud. One letter was to Michael, where I told him everything I could not say on the phone, that my choices were not betrayals but boundaries, that my fight was not against him but against disappearing. Another was to Lily, thanking her for seeing me when others refused. Another was to Linda, a confession of my fears, my regrets, my stubborn hope. Each letter I sealed in an envelope and tucked into a box, the same box where my important papers now lay. Perhaps one day they would be read, perhaps not. But writing them gave me peace. As autumn deepened, the shelter planned a community dinner for Thanksgiving. The director asked me to help organize it, and for the first time in years, I felt the thrill of purpose stir within me. I baked apple pies, Linda's recipe, perfected over decades. And as the scent filled my apartment, I remembered the sting of watching my pie sit untouched at Michael's table. This time would be different. At the dinner, when the pies were placed on the long tables, people dove in eagerly, their faces lighting up with each bite. Compliments poured in, not out of politeness, but genuine delight. I felt tears prick my eyes as I realized the recipe that had been dismissed so casually in one house was cherished deeply in another. That evening, after the dinner ended and the tables were cleared, a woman from the shelter approached me with a shy smile. "Robert," she said, "that pie tasted like home. I haven't felt that in years. Thank you." Her words sank into me like a balm. It was proof that the pieces of Linda, the pieces of me, could live on in places I never expected. When Lily heard about the dinner, she insisted on helping me the next time. Together, we measured flour, sliced apples, and laughed as the kitchen filled with the sweet scent of cinnamon. She wore Linda's old apron, far too big for her, but she tied it proudly around her waist. Watching her, I felt as if Linda herself was standing beside us, smiling at the bridge being built between past and future. Life did not suddenly become easy. Michael still kept his distance, Emily still cast her shadows, and the gap between us remained. But I had stopped measuring my worth by their approval. I had built a rhythm that sustained me, a circle of people who valued me not for what I could give them, but for who I was. And in that circle, I found strength. One night, sitting by the window with Lily's notebook in my lap, I realized something profound. For so long, I had defined myself by sacrifice, by what I had poured into others. But now, I understood that survival was not enough. Living meant refusing to vanish, even when others wished you would fade quietly into the background. Living meant carving your name into the present, not waiting for others to decide if you were worthy of being remembered. And so, as winter approached and the world outside grew cold, I found myself warmed not by the house I had lost, but by the life I was reclaiming. For the first time in many years, I did not feel like a shadow in someone else's story. I felt like the author of my own. Winter came with a quiet ferocity, laying a white blanket over the city that muffled its usual noise. From my apartment window, I watched children press their faces against frosted glass, watched their parents tug scarves tighter around their necks as they hurried across icy sidewalks. I felt the familiar sting of loneliness creep in during those cold evenings. But unlike before, I did not let it swallow me whole. Instead, I wrapped myself in layers, stepped out into the biting wind, and sought the warmth of community at the shelter. The shelter became more than a place to volunteer. It became a second home, a sanctuary, where the forgotten gathered to remind each other that they still existed. I noticed how the residents began to wait for me, how they seemed to listen differently when I spoke. They called me Mr. Miller with a respect that filled the hollow spaces left by my own family. It was not about being important, it was about being seen. One evening, after I had finished serving bowls of steaming soup, a man named Clarence approached me. His face was weathered like old leather, his voice raspy from years of cigarettes and hard living. He sat beside me with a sigh and said, "You remind me of my old man. He was stubborn too. Never let anyone tell him what to do. I wish I had listened to him more." His words landed heavier than he knew. I wondered if Michael would one day sit across from someone and say the same about me. Lily, true to her word, continued recording my stories. She had started to organize them into chapters, childhood memories, years with Linda, struggles and sacrifices. I marveled at her dedication, her curiosity, the way she seemed determined to preserve the pieces of me that others had tried to overlook. One Saturday, as snowflakes drifted lazily past the window, she asked, "Grandpa, if you could tell Dad one thing, just one thing, what would it be?" I thought for a long time before answering. I would tell him that strength isn't about control, it's about respect. Respect for those who came before you, respect for the sacrifices that shaped your life. Without that, strength is just selfishness, dressed up in pride. She wrote it down, nodding with solemn understanding, and I realized how deeply she listened, how carefully she held on to my words. It gave me hope that even if Michael never understood, the truth of who I was would not vanish. But the universe has a way of testing our resolve. One evening, as I returned home, I found Michael waiting outside my building. He was leaning against his car, his breath fogging in the icy air. His expression was not the defiance I had come to expect, but something more complicated, anger laced with exhaustion, pride tangled with doubt. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I nodded, unlocking the door and gesturing for him to come inside. We sat across from each other in the small living room, the silence stretching between us like a fragile bridge. Finally, he spoke. "Emily thinks you're trying to make me look like the bad guy. She thinks you're rewriting everything to make me seem ungrateful." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Michael, this isn't about making you look like anything. This is about me finally refusing to disappear. For too long, I let others make decisions as if my voice didn't matter. That stops now." His jaw clenched. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect you." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "Protect me? By selling the house without telling me? By laughing when my pie sat untouched? By asking me to take the picture instead of standing in it? That's not protection, Michael, that's erasure." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, I saw his shoulders slump, his bravado falter. He rubbed his temples as though the weight of what I had said was sinking in. "I never wanted you to feel erased," he whispered. "Intentions don't erase impact," I said softly, "and impact is what lasts." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the radiator. Then he stood abruptly, muttering something about needing time, and left. The slam of the door echoed, but I no longer felt the familiar ache of abandonment. Instead, I felt a strange peace, because for once he had heard me. That night, I sat by the window with Linda's photo in my lap. "We're getting somewhere," I murmured to her smile. "Slowly, but we're getting somewhere." And the days that followed Michael's visit felt different, as though the air itself had shifted. For the first time in years, I sensed cracks forming in the wall he had built between us. He had left my apartment unsettled, but not in denial. His silence afterward was not the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of a man forced to wrestle with truths he could no longer ignore. I held on to that small shift, like a man clutching an ember in winter, careful not to let it go out. Meanwhile, life at the shelter continued to pull me forward. The Thanksgiving dinner had sparked something within the community, a reminder that dignity could be restored through shared meals and small kindnesses. Plans for a Christmas gathering were already in motion, and I was asked to help lead it. I threw myself into the preparations, not out of distraction, but because for the first time since Linda's passing, I felt I was part of something alive and growing. One afternoon, while stringing lights along the shelter's hallways, Lily appeared at the door, her cheeks red from the cold, her eyes bright with purpose. She had brought a stack of papers, typed pages, neatly stapled together. "Grandpa," she said breathlessly, "I typed up the stories from my notebook. It's like a book now. I wanted to show you." I sat with her at a table, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped through the pages. There were chapters about my childhood, about Linda, about Michael when he was young. But more than that, there were reflections, her words interwoven with mine, her observations about strength, sacrifice, and resilience. She had taken my life and given it shape, not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament. Tears blurred my vision, and I placed a hand over hers. "Lily, this is more than a book. This is proof that I was here, that I mattered." And she squeezed my hand tightly, her voice steady. "You'll never be erased, Grandpa, not as long as I'm here." Those words carried me through the bitter cold of December, through the nights when loneliness still tried to creep in. Because now I knew that even if Michael and Emily chose not to honor me, Lily had already ensured that my legacy was secured. On Christmas Eve, the shelter was transformed. String lights glowed warmly against the frosted windows. Tables were laden with food, and carols drifted through the air. People who had once sat with slumped shoulders and vacant eyes now laughed, clinked cups, and sang together. I moved through the crowd with a pie in my hands, greeted not with indifference, but with gratitude. For the first time in years, the sight of a pie did not bring me back to the humiliation of that backyard. It brought me joy. Near the end of the evening, as I stepped outside for fresh air, I found Michael standing by the entrance. He looked out of place, his expensive coat and polished shoes a stark contrast against the shabby bricks of the shelter. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the snow falling softly between us. Then he cleared his throat. "Lily told me about the book," he said. I nodded. "She's been working hard. She has a gift." His eyes dropped to the snow. "She showed me some of it. I didn't realize how much I'd forgotten, or how much I'd ignored." The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. I waited, giving him space to continue. He shifted uncomfortably, then added, "I've been angry because I thought you didn't trust me. But maybe it's me who hasn't been worthy of trust." I felt something inside me soften, though I kept my voice steady. "Michael, all I ever wanted was respect. Not control, not power, just respect. You don't have to agree with every choice I make, but you can't erase me from them." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the boy he once was flicker across his face. "I don't know how to fix everything," he admitted quietly. "You start," I said gently, "by seeing me not as an obstacle, but as your father." The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was tentative, fragile, but filled with possibility. He nodded once, then extended his hand. I took it, and though it was not the embrace I longed for, it was a beginning. When I returned inside, Lily beamed at me as though she already knew what had passed outside. She slipped her arm through mine and whispered, "I told you he'd come around." I smiled, not because I believed everything was healed, but because I finally believed healing was possible. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Linda. I imagined her watching from wherever she might be, her laughter echoing in approval. I whispered into the darkness, "We're finding our way back, love. Slowly, but we're finding it." And for the first time in a very long time, I fell asleep, not with the weight of loss pressing on my chest, but with the warmth of hope filling it. As the new year arrived, the city seemed to wake from its winter slumber with a kind of brittle determination. The sidewalks were still blanketed in ice, but people moved briskly, their coats pulled tight, their breaths forming clouds of resolve in the cold air. I felt that same sense of awakening stirring within me. Something had shifted after Christmas Eve, after that brief conversation with Michael outside the shelter. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was no longer hostility. It was an opening, a crack in the wall through which light might someday filter. I began to notice small changes. Michael's calls, once rare and edged with irritation, became slightly more frequent. The tone was still guarded, but there were fewer sharp edges. He asked how I was, almost casually, as if testing the waters. Emily never spoke on those calls, and I suspected she wasn't happy about the shift. But for once, Michael's voice sounded like his own, not an echo of hers. I learned to take those small steps as victories, not because I craved validation, but because they reminded me that the bond between father and son could bend without fully breaking. Lily, ever my confidant, threw herself deeper into her project. She had started editing the manuscript of my stories, adding photographs she had scavenged from old boxes and albums I hadn't opened in years. She laughed as she showed me pictures of Michael as a boy, his hair messy, his smile wide, his eyes filled with a joy I hadn't seen in decades. "Look at this," she giggled. "Dad used to be the goofy one." I studied the photograph, remembering that child vividly, and I wondered how life had hardened him into someone who could stand in his own backyard and let his wife dismiss me. It hurt to see the contrast, but it also gave me hope. Because if he had once been that boy, perhaps he could find pieces of him again. The shelter's Christmas gathering had been such a success that the director asked me to help organize a New Year's dinner as well. I agreed, pouring myself into the preparations with renewed energy. The residents began to treat me less like a volunteer and more like one of their own, a fellow traveler in the landscape of survival. I realized that in giving them my time and presence, I was also giving myself something essential, a sense of belonging. I wasn't a shadow at their tables. I was part of the circle. One evening, as I scrubbed pans in the kitchen, Clarence, the man who had once told me I reminded him of his father, leaned against the counter. "Miller," he said, his voice gravelly, "you ever think maybe all the pain we go through isn't wasted? Maybe it's fertilizer. Makes the ground richer for whatever comes next." I paused, rinsing the soap from my hands, and nodded. "That's exactly what I've been learning. Pain doesn't erase us. It reshapes us. And if we're lucky, it grows something worth passing on." Clarence chuckled. "Then you're one lucky man." His words echoed in my mind long after he left the kitchen. Lucky. I had never thought of myself that way. But perhaps luck wasn't about avoiding pain. Perhaps it was about finding meaning within it. As winter thawed into early spring, Michael surprised me with an invitation. "Dad," he said over the phone, "Lily's birthday is coming up. We're having a dinner. I think you should come." The words were cautious, tentative, but they landed like a gift. I agreed, though my heart tightened with nerves. I remembered too well the sting of the last family gathering, the cruel laughter, the untouched pie. But I also remembered Lily's steady gaze, her hand squeezing mine, her voice promising I would never be erased. For her sake, I would face it. On the evening of her birthday, I walked into Michael's new house, a place sleek and modern, with wide windows and polished floors. It felt nothing like the home that had been sold, but I kept my head high, refusing to let nostalgia weigh me down. Lily greeted me first, her arms wrapping tightly around my waist. "Grandpa, you came," she beamed, and the joy in her voice was all the validation I needed. Michael approached, his smile uncertain but genuine. "Dad," he said quietly, "thanks for coming." Emily hovered behind him, her polite smile as practiced as ever. But I noticed something different. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. This was Michael's invitation, his choice, and that meant something. The evening was not perfect. There were awkward pauses, moments when conversation faltered, and times when I felt Emily's eyes on me like a silent critique. But Lily's laughter filled the gaps, and Michael made small efforts to bridge the silence. He asked me about the shelter, about the pies I'd baked, about things he had never cared to know before. They were small gestures, but they were gestures nonetheless. When it came time for cake, Lily insisted I stand beside her as she blew out her candles. The room filled with cheers, and for the first time in years, I was not behind the camera, not erased from the frame. I stood there, shoulder to shoulder with my granddaughter, part of the picture, part of the memory. My chest swelled with a quiet pride that no words could capture. After the guests had gone, and the house grew quiet, Michael walked me to the door. He hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Dad," he said slowly, "I know I've made mistakes. I don't know if I can undo them, but I'm trying." I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension beneath his coat. "That's all I've ever asked, Michael. Not perfection, just effort." He nodded, his eyes glistening with something unspoken, and for the first time in a long time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. That night, as I walked home under the starlit sky, I whispered to Linda, "We're healing, love. Not all at once, not easily, but piece by piece." And for the first time in many years, the ache in my chest eased, replaced by a fragile but undeniable hope. When I look back now, I realize this journey was never about a house or even about money. It was about dignity, the quiet, stubborn dignity of a man who refuses to be erased while still breathing. For so many years, I believed my worth was measured by sacrifice, by how much I could give and how little I demanded in return. I thought love meant silence, thought respect would come simply because I had earned it. But life has a cruel way of teaching you that respect must be claimed, not assumed, and that love without acknowledgement is not enough to sustain a soul. I learned that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is found in a granddaughter who listens more deeply than anyone else, who preserves your words when others try to forget them. Sometimes it is discovered in strangers at a shelter, men and women with nothing left but their stories, who remind you that you are not alone in your struggles. Sometimes it is simply the echo of your own voice, steady and unyielding, reminding you that you still matter. If you are listening to my story and you have ever felt invisible in your own home, I want you to know this. You are not a burden. You are not a shadow. You are the roots that hold the tree steady, and without you, the branches would fall. Do not let anyone convince you that your years, your wisdom, your love are disposable. They are not. They are priceless. To the fathers, the grandfathers, the men and women who have poured everything into others only to feel forgotten, stand tall. Reclaim your place. You are not defined by what has been taken from you, but by what you choose to keep. I spent my life taking care of everyone else, and only recently did I learn the greatest truth. Sometimes, taking care of yourself is the most powerful legacy you can leave behind. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in my words, I ask you to join me on this journey. Subscribe, share, and support this channel so that together we can continue telling stories that remind every forgotten soul. You are still here, you still matter, and you will never be erased.